So what are those conventions of epic poetry that comprise the elevated language that it demands? One thing is a literary convention is a feature that occurs repeatedly in a literary type or genre. And so the conventions of epic poetry include some features that you might look for. The first thing is that every epic poem opens with an invocation to the muse. Now, you know who the muses are. The muses were the 9 daughters of Namazane, whose name means memory. And you know what an invocation is. An invocation to voice a prayer, voice, to voice a prayer asking for a blessing or asking for something. Every Sunday, if you watch NASCAR, there's a minister who invokes the blessings of God on the racers to try and keep them safe and have pretty weather and whatever. Well, what the poet in an epic poem is asking for is that the muse speak through him to convey the story in a manner that suits its theme. Hesiod put a lot of stock in his invocation to the muse by saying that essentially he spoke truth because the muse of epic poetry, Calliope, inspired or literally breathed into the poet the story he will recount. Later, Plato will say that, poets aren't really all that grand because ultimately all they do is say what the muse tells them. The second convention is an epic theme. The theme should be worthy of the poet and the length and the number of words and lines he spends upon the subject he's writing about. The epic theme is the focus then of the poem. In the Iliad, the poet focuses on the rage of Achilles. And Stanley Lombardo, the translator of the particular version that we're reading, begins with that particular phrase. In fact, the poem begins, rage, sing goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds, as Zeus's will was done. Now, as Sheila Murnahan points out in her wonderful introduction, that's translated different ways. Some translators might say anger, some translators might say song, but she says that the word menos is only used in Greek as a kind of supernatural rage. Achilles' rage is a rage that ultimately is worthy only of the gods. And of course, when we look at the Odyssey, we have a similar theme, which is the warrior going home. The third convention of epic poetry is the epic question. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we're not reading these poems in the original Greek. We're reading translations, and translators are always trying to update their material to make it fit more in the language of the contemporary people that they're trying to share these works with. We would probably not love Chapman's Homer the way Keats did, who, when he first encountered it, thought that Chapman's translation made Homer come alive. So in this particular version of the Iliad, we're reading Stanley Lombardo's translation, and he asks the epic question as an epic question. After he finishes the invocation, he asks, among the gods who brought this quarrel on. Emily Wilson, who translated the version of the Odyssey, never really asks it as a question, but the way you will determine what it is not by looking necessarily at the particular style she's using. Her style is much, much more conversational in that poem than Stanley Lombardo's is in the Iliad. But what the epic question will always focus on is which God? Which god has this hero gotten on the bad side of? Who has this hero offended? And when you know that, you will know what the epic question is, because the question will, of course, play out in the theme, and the question will be answered by explaining how that god was ultimately placated, if as he or she would have to be if the hero is to survive, and sort of how that anger of the god plays out in whatever quest, whether it's the quest to win a war or it's a quest to get back home from war. So always focus on what god is really, really not happy with our hero, and you will know what the epic question is. Now, we've already talked about how Greek society, like all society, is organized around a shared set of values. So when we talk about the will of the gods and we talk about the will of Zeus playing its way out until the end, just keep in mind that the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon does not spring out of nowhere. It comes from Agamemnon's failure first to observe the courtesies due to Apollo's priest and thereby offending him. Now, once that quarrel is set out, the way it plays out will be the driving force of the poem's plot. And so while it will be Achilles' rage that sets the scene for finally the resolution of this war, it was really Agamemnon's hubris that essentially made the Greeks anger Apollo, end up dying from plague, who sort of created the situation which would end up making Agamemnon angry, or excuse me, would end up making Achilles angry. Now, I want to remind you that all of these conventions of epic poetry that Homer uses have been identified and imitated by other epic poets like Virgil, Dante, and Milton in their literary epics. So number 4 is the stock epithet. A stock epithet is technically an appositive phrase or a noun phrase. And a stock epithet is either used beside or in place of a character's name. Master of the Silver Bow and Sminthean or Mouse God are both used, sometimes in place of Apollo's name, sometimes right beside it. Athena is called the gray-eyed goddess and the protector of cities. Achilles is often called the swift runner, and for reasons that have never become apparent to me, Hector remains the breaker of horses, and apparently there are stories that have fed Homer's telling of these tales, that where probably there was some legend associated with Hector that we do no longer have that would explain that to us. The 5th convention of epic poetry is the Bardic formulae. And anytime you're talking about a formula, it's like, okay, I'm going to do it this way every time. So Bardic formula or poetic formulas are phrases that occur and reoccur as stock descriptions rather than original turns of phrases. Boreas walks in her beauty. Dawn spreads out her fingertips of rose. And so as you read, see if you can identify other of those Bardic formulae and the phrases that represent them. One of my favorite conventions of epic poetry is the epic simile. You know that a simile is a comparison between two objects using like or as. And an epic simile, like everything else about an epic, is long. It's also much, much more ornate than a typical simile. For example, one of my favorite Scottish poems, Robert Burns, might say, "My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June." Okay, that's fine, we get that. But But the traditional construction of an epic simile is as thus and so, so the subject that I'm really describing. And there are some really interesting ones about Paris, because Paris is kind of an interesting character in this poem anyway. Um, and he is in the battle with Menelaus that never actually gets fought. He's called as entering the arena like a god. In this instance, he is being kind of compared to a racehorse, and it's very interesting if you look at the length of the simile, because we might think, okay, a racehorse is sleek, a racehorse is fast, but look how ornately Homer describes Paris when he re-enters the battle after his brother Hector comes and tries to get him sort of re-inspired and gets him to pay attention to the task. Paris, in the meantime, had not lingered. After he buckled his bright war gear on, he ran through Troy, sure-footed the long strides. Think how a stallion fed on clover and barley, mettlesome, thundering in a stall, may snap his picket rope and canter down a field, to bathe as he would daily in the river, glorying in freedom, head held high with mane over his shoulders flying. His dazzling work of finely jointed knees takes him around the pasture haunts of horses. Now, there's something kind of gay and lovely about this simile that appears in the middle of a very, very bloody war, but it's also indicative of Paris's character. It's not really so much that Paris is a coward as it is that he just can't focus. Maybe he gets distracted. He thinks of Helen in the bed and he wants to go check on her. And as soon as Hector says, you know, Paris, this is a battle because you brought this woman home and the Greeks came to get her. He has that sort of youth and lack of seriousness, and it makes him a really good foil for his brother Hector, who is, of course, the real hero of the Trojans, and the real reason if they survive, they're going to. Epic catalogs are long lists, and I think in maybe another class that I teach, I said something about it's kind of the lifestyles of the rich and famous. When we watch these shows that we have people going through these houses that I could never afford, but they're beautiful. And so these epic catalogs would have impressed listeners with sheer numbers. There's the catalog of ships that sailed to Troy, the gifts Agamemnon offers to Achilles to coax him back into battle, or the long lists of nymphs that I'm sure you loved reading about in Hesiod's Theogony. And what's interesting and what roots the Iliad in an oral tradition, of course, is that basically we get the same catalog in this story twice. So, we watch these series on Netflix or whatever, and then, my husband sometimes will watch a couple of episodes of the series he's already seen if it's been a while, so he'll kind of know what's going on. So imagine no TV, no Netflix, no novels really even, so that everything is done orally. And of course, the poet would have memorized these long lists, and people would have enjoyed hearing these wonderful, beautiful items that they would not be able to afford. Another convention is the arming of the warrior. There are long descriptions of putting the armor on. And this carries into the romances of the medieval period, where the sword comes from, where the shield came from, the description of it. There is a ritual attending the arming, and the provenance of his weapons or armor, and of course the provenance of the particular shield that Achilles uses when he goes back into battle is that that it was made for him by Hephaestus the god. And the scene indicates war and peace, and it kind of makes poignant again the brevity of the life of the hero and the peace that war interrupts and destroys. There are warning dreams, and sometimes in warning dreams, the gods lie. Um, you know, Zeus sends a warning dream to Agamemnon, thinking that it's going to buck him up and make him really want to fight. And that if he tells this dream to the soldiers, he says, tell them, and they'll really want to fight. And it has the opposite effect. It makes them all want to go home. There are also visits to the underworld in most epic poems. It makes up a whole third of Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante visits hell. So not all epic poems that you read is going to have every single one of these, but every attempt to replicate the epic form will have most of them.